So this week we are covering the prosecution, chapter 3. So the introduction, obviously the prosecution play a large role in the American court system. In criminal courts, they are the attorneys for the state of California. They are going to bring charges, and they have different duties than other attorneys do to uphold and do what's best for the community as a whole. So the adversary system has two parties, the prosecution and the defense. Oftentimes we think of them being at odds with one another, but actually the prosecutor's whole job is to stand up for what's in the best interest of society. So their job is not, in fact, to get a conviction, but it's to do what is right. Meaning, if they receive evidence that proves the defendant is not guilty of the crime, they are obligated to submit that to the court and release the defendant as an innocent individual. The defense, on the other hand, is there for the defendant, and they are there to represent the defendant and to get them acquitted of whatever charges they have filed against them. And we'll get to the defense in the next chapter. Inculpatory evidence is evidence that shows guilt of the defendant in a trial, and exculpatory is what shows their innocence. Prosecutors determine who will be charged, what they're charged with, make plea bargain offers, and what type of plea bargain they're going to make. Now, why is that important? Well, prosecutors have to look at what is in the general interest of the public. So if in the general interest you are saving money and time, then that individual should be afforded a plea bargain, and you have to weigh out the benefits to the detriment for society. There are no legislative guidelines on charging. Decision to dismiss in most instances or immune from review, and there's no explicit criteria for deciding whether or not to charge an individual. The standard is whether or not there's sufficient evidence to go forward to show that that individual is guilty, more likely than not, of the crime. Now, the standard is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So keep that in mind, because that's different than civil court. Prosecutors have a professional standard that's spelled by the American Bar Association. This includes reasonable doubt, they must dismiss, the harm caused by the offense, improper motives of the complainant, or reluctance of the complainant to testify, or the cooperation of the accused in the apprehension or conviction of other offenders. And that's where potential plea bargains can come into play. So, how do they decide not to file a charge? They may decide to not file if they believe the individual is not guilty, or guilty but doesn't believe a conviction is possible. And a lot of you probably get very frustrated with that. And in a perfect world, you would want to go after every individual that you believed was guilty and put them behind bars. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time, energy, and resources to do so. So we want to make sure we weigh that out and determine what's best for society. So what factors affect these decisions? Well, research. They can attempt to avoid uncertainty if the evidence is weak, or if they're worried about sympathetic juries, or if there's other extenuating circumstances potentially that play into it. And other factors in charging may be the legally irrelevant characteristics of the individual, whether it be background, behavior, motivation, race of either the victim or the offender, character or credibility of the individual victims, and the relationship between the victim and the suspect. So maybe you have an individual as a victim who is a habitual offender. So they are a drug dealer or something else, and they have a very questionable background, and so they are your only witness against an individual for drug trafficking. Well, most juries probably aren't going to believe the drug dealer turning in the drug trafficker. So that would maybe be something you need to look at in charging the individuals. You may also have limited resources or a lack of motivation on the part of the prosecution's office. And oftentimes it could be an issue of family affairs. So you don't want to get involved to some degree in a domestic violence claim because you're going to let the civil side of it handle it, something like that. So what else? They screen cases for prosecution. They determine their strategy. They assign cases. They interview witnesses, and then obviously they work with law enforcement. Assigning priority cases on a basis of which is most deserving. So say, you have a little child that's murdered. That's probably going to have a bigger weight than a habitual drug offender, potentially. And then most convictions are obtained through plea bargains. So over 90% of cases settle out. So what strategy do they use when they go to court? So they have to get a theory or a motive of why the individual did what they did. They must then link it to the defendant, and they must have somewhat of a plausible explanation as to why an individual would do this. So the hardest cases to prove are when there is no motive, no evidence, or no explanation. And those are the cases that you definitely want to plea out. In some jurisdictions, you may have to assign a workload, and then large city DAs like Los Angeles or San Francisco may have different attorneys that have different specialties, say drug or gang unit or murder. Those individual DAs would then be specialized in those fields. They must often interview people who knowledge of the crime, and then they can use them as witnesses, either for the defense and depose them to make sure that the individual's story stays consistent throughout the trial. So let's say you have, a questionable individual and their story continues to change. Well, that's not going to be helpful in getting a conviction. Relationship with law enforcement is also incredibly important. The officers have firsthand knowledge of the crime scenes and often have the experience that you need in having an individual testify. And then roughly 50% of the states have grand juries that have present indictments so that they're able to take the case to trial. And we talked about this in our grand jury last week. But remember, in an indictment, only the prosecutor is presenting a case. They don't hear the defense side of it, and they're only weighing the amount of evidence they have to be able to go to trial. They are not deciding the guilt or innocence of the individual because likely they're only getting half the story. Prosecutors are often under pressures from lots of different sources. Obviously, the victims' families, society, taxpayers, their office bosses. They want to make sure that they obtain convictions on cases that they truly believe the individual is guilty of the crime. And then they obviously orchestrate all the case and put it together. Now, prosecutorial bluffing is when a prosecutor threatens a defendant with a lengthy list of charges. This can be considered misconduct if they don't have the evidence to support the charges. Remember, they work for society as a whole, determining the best cause of action in these cases. Their goal is to not get a conviction if they believe that the individual is not guilty of the crimes. The intent to convince a defendant to enter a guilty plea is one of the more minor charges in exchange for leniency. And then overcharging may be successful in other cases, but again, we want to make sure that it's a fair standard. Prosecutors can use additional charges to get guilty pleas if there's a probable cause that they have those charges and that they were committed. And then if they get evidence from witnesses, they can use it against the individual. They cannot suppress the evidence. They must disclose it all to the defense, whether or not they use it in trial. So if they have evidence that shows an alibi for an individual, they must give it to the defense. Because again, it's not civil court where you're trying to win. You're trying to get to the correct information or the correct truth as to whether or not this individual is guilty of a crime. Prospective jurors are questioned about their qualifications, beliefs, and prejudice. And remember, we have an entire chapter on juries, so we'll get to those when we get over, I believe it's chapter 6. And then offering inadmissible evidence or hearsay evidence is not admissible, and it would be against the best interest of the prosecutor because it's not being able to be used against the individual. Malicious prosecution is a charge that you can bring against a prosecutor if you can prove that the individual had full knowledge that the person was innocent and decided to charge them anyway as a personal vendetta against the person. Now, there are lots of cases of malicious persecution, and I encourage you to look those up and actually see the high threshold that is warranted for those. And again, that goes into the misconduct. And then again, they have an ethical standard to uphold the best interest that's clear and consistent for society as a whole. They are not trying to put innocent people away. Their goal is to get to the truth. Now, the harmless error doctrine, an appellate court can affirm a conviction despite the presence of serious prosecutorial misconduct during a trial if they can prove that the misconduct would not have changed the outcome. Now, that's a very difficult threshold to prove since most likely it would change the outcome. So again, if you have any questions, let me know.